When it comes to the barbell row, almost everyone I talk to is on one extreme end of the spectrum or the other. I either get guys who say, barbell rows are my bread and butter back movement. They're a staple in my training and by far the best movement for overall back development. Or I get guys who say,
barbell rows are terrible for your back. Barbell rows are not optimal. My back hurts just from watching that.
And honestly, this frustrates me because a lot of times guys who take these extreme stances are usually guys that aren't even talking about the same movement. The fact is, there's about 5 to 10 different variations of the barbell row alone. And most people are either singling out one movement or they don't even know how to perform the proper variation for their specific goals. So if you want to build a bigger back using barbell row, if you're unsure how to barbell row properly, you don't know which variation you should use for your goal, or you're someone who just thinks that the movement is terrible or not optimal, don't worry, I got you covered in this video. We're gonna fix all that today. Let's just first start this off by saying that when we say the barbell row, we simply mean using a barbell to row, as the name implies. But the exact technique you use can actually be divided into 5 different positions, each of which you could actually make 2 technique alterations. Let's start with the first position. You have the most upright position of barbell row, and that is the Yates row. Generally, this is used as a lat-specific row variation that also targets the traps heavily. Second variation you have is the standard barbell row, which is generally done at about a 45-degree angle. This being a bit more bent over will work the lower back a bit more, as it's now forced to stabilize the body in a bent over position, and this is more of an overall back builder, building the upper back, the middle back, and the traps. However, compared to the Yates row, it's definitely a bit less lat specific. Next, we're gonna bend forward even more and do a fully bent over row. The truth is here, most people use the term barbell row and bent over row interchangeably. But until you're in this position, you're not really doing a true bent over barbell row. But this variation will place a lot more tension on the upper back and less on the lats. Let's talk about position number 4. You have the pendulé row or the dead stop row. Position's almost the same as the fully bent over row here, but we're actually just slightly more bent over to where a 45-pound plate will touch the floor. Basically, you're gonna start in a deadlift or a hip hinge position here, but instead of pulling the weight from the floor, you're actually gonna row it. Finally, number 5 is the deficit barbell row. At first glance, this one is gonna look the hardest, and I know all the keyboard warriors are gonna say, that's not optimal. But let me tell you right now that training in this position actually has a lot of advantages if you're training specifically for hypertrophy. So don't sleep on it. But now let's break down each one of these variations in detail. Let's go back to number 1, the Yates row. This one, you're gonna be very upright. You want your back and your torso in a position here where when your arms are fully extended with the bar, your hands or the bar touch just the top of your knees. From here, you wanna take a narrow grip on that bar, just around shoulder width. Now with an upright torso position here, you wanna lock yourself into that position and pull those elbows back, pulling the bar to the lower belly button or the waistline. If you do this correctly, you should feel a huge contraction in those lats, and your traps should also get a very solid pump. Now, because you're very upright here, this variation tends to have a lot less stress on the lower back, but it also doesn't concentrate much on the entire back here. It's a very solid lat and trap specific row. So if you need specific attention to that area of your back, this barbell row variation is for you. But if you need to work the entire back more, this is a more specialized variation and likely not the best option. Second, let's move on to the traditional 45-degree barbell row. Now with this bent over position here, the bar should come down just slightly below the knee or mid-shin. You're gonna use the same grip here that you did on a Yates row, but you're gonna pull that bar slightly higher than the belly button. This bent over row position does a few things. First, this variation will require you to use a lot more lower back as it's required to stabilize that weight since you're a lot more bent over. If you do have a lower back imbalance, this movement is gonna expose it right away. Now with the torso angled more to the ground, the angle of the bar path here is gonna force a lot more tension on the upper back to do the work. This movement now becomes a good mix of lats and upper back, and it's generally why this is the technique that's done for a standard barbell row. But this movement does have a lot of drawbacks as well. In my opinion, this variation is likely to be the least optimal of them all, even while it does work the entire back fairly evenly. If any one of these variations actually limits how much you could train the upper back close to or near failure, this is the variation. Since you're in a position now where you're still very strong and the upper back can do a lot of the work, you're likely to be able to handle a lot of weight even in this position. But now your lower back has to be just as strong to handle the kind of weights that your upper back is able to pull. If you do have a very strong lower back, this variation could be excellent for overall back development. And I mean, if you want to hammer everything in one movement, this is your go-to variation. But let's say you have an imbalance in your lower back or it's just weak, this movement will have a lot of limitations. Next variation is number 3 with the traditional, real, what I would call bent over barbell row. Now with this one, we're aiming to as close as possible to a 90-degree angle, but we don't want those plates to touch the floor, especially if we're using 45s. If you are using 45s, those plates should stop just before they touch the ground when your arms are fully extended. Now this variation offers a lot more, especially if your goal is specifically to train the upper back. The first thing is that you're able to get a full stretch at the bottom of the movement. Because we're bent over even more here, we're essentially rowing at a 90-degree angle, which is a similar angle to, let's say, a seated cable row or a machine row. The other two variations with the arms fully extended, there's a lot of traps involved when you're at the bottom. This one is almost purely upper back, which means the traps and the lats aren't assisting as much. And now, since it's more of a targeted movement, not only do you not need as much weight, but you actually can't handle as much weight, as your upper back is doing most of the work on its own. That also means that your lower back doesn't have to work to stabilize as heavy a load on the bar. And in my opinion, despite what most fitness gurus on YouTube say, your lower back is really not the limiting factor for most people in this movement. For example, I could generally train with 315 pounds for 10 to 12 reps on something like a Yates row. But with a bent over barbell row, I'm not using any more than 225 pounds for 10 to 12 reps. But now let's talk about the next variation, the dead stop row. This movement is set up almost identical to the bent over barbell row. We're just bending over slightly more so that if we're using 45-pound plates, they're touching the floor. This movement setup is exactly the same as you would at the start of a deadlift. But instead of pulling with those hips, we're rowing the weight off the floor. Now with this variation, the muscles being worked here is still the upper back specifically, but this allows you to rest the weights on the floor every single rep. This also removes any momentum from the lift, which is big, because the problem most people run into with any row variation, if they're not careful, is using their hips, their lower back, and momentum to swing the weight. This variation ensures that the only thing that's working here is the upper back. This variation is also excellent to ensure standardized technique with each and every rep you do. I'm personally a huge fan of including this variation side by side with a bent over barbell row, even in the same session. I'll generally do something like 2 sets of barbell rows, then after the fatigue starts to set in, 2 sets of dead stop rows to finish off the upper back. Now finally, the last variation, and one that's going to make the optimal training community's head explode, the deficit barbell row. This setup here is also the same as a standard bent over row, but there are a few tweaks. One, you're going to stand on a box. Arnold used to actually stand on the edge of a flat bench doing these, which I don't recommend. The box accomplishes the same thing, and it's just more safe. Only difference here is you're gonna grab a slightly wider grip than you would with the other barbell row variation. And third, because of the position of this exercise, you're gonna be forced to pull that bar a bit higher on the torso than the other lifts. You know, at first glance, this movement might look like you're doing the same thing as any other barbell row variation, but just off of a box for greater range of motion. But there's a lot more to it than just that. First thing you need to understand with this lift is that because we're on a box and we're in a more bent over position, we're forced to pull our hips back further. This is the only way to keep a flat back here. And now what this does is it pulls that bar closer to your body than these other barbell row variations. With a standard bent over row, because of the position of the torso, the bar is actually out in front a little bit more and not directly underneath like this variation. And when we bend over this much, because the hips are back so far and the bar is closer to the body, believe it or not, we're actually causing less stress to the lower back, despite being in a more bent over position. But you're still gonna have a very strong lower back to do this. But with the bar closer to the shins and less force of the torso being pulled forward, and because we're pulling with all upper back here, again, we can't use very much weight. So in my opinion, this is one of the better variations if the upper back is specifically the area you're trying to work on, as the amount of weight that you can pull with your upper back in this position and the amount of weight that your lower back can support in this position are actually much closer together than any other barbell row variation. I need no more than 225 pounds in this position. And most training sessions, I'm realistically using about 185. All that as someone who's deadlifted over 500 pounds before. So needing to stabilize 185 pounds with my lower back, it's not a big deal. And although this is one of my favorite barbell row variations at the moment, and I'm using it a lot in my training, each variation has its place. And it's important to use the one that best suits you and your goals. If you need more lats and traps, do more Yates row. If you need overall back development, stick with the 45-degree barbell row. If you need more middle and upper back specifically, hammer those bent over rows, dead stop rows, and deficit rows. But one more secret before I finish off the video. Each one of these row variations can be tweaked to be more lat specific or more upper back specific. If you want more upper back on any of these variations, go with a slightly wider grip and pull with those elbows out. If you want more lats, go with a narrower grip and pull with those elbows tucked in. You'll often see me taking more of an upper back specific row, something like a bent over row, but incorporating a more close grip with the elbows tucked to make it more of a lat specific exercise. Now, it's more of a hybrid movement. But first, start with a variation that best suits your goals. And then go on to an elbows out position if you need more upper back, or an elbows in position if you need more lats. But don't overcomplicate it. The barbell row is a foundational exercise that can be used and altered for your goals. And it's a movement that anyone can benefit from if done correctly and safely. This is why I'm such a hardcore believer in rows. They've just done more for my back than any other exercise. And it's why they're always a staple in my training and key lifts in all my programs, like my old school mass gain training system. If you're truly looking to maximize your physique, forget the copy and paste random workouts that you found online. Check out my old school mass gain training system. Not only gives you the exact routines to follow, whether you're training 5 days per week, 4, or even 3, but an entire video course where I download all of my knowledge to you and everything you need to know using this system to build more muscle. You can check it out at the link below. And as always, if you want to see more of the best original bodybuilding content just like this, make sure to hit subscribe.